introduction on how to start deciphering everything as you study astrology. You all have been given a copy of George Bush's chart, and I put it up here for you so we can look at it this way too. George Bush, July 6, 1946, 7:26 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time in New Haven, Connecticut. So the charts that you have in front of you should be very similar to this. So it's nice to see some familiar faces, and it's nice to see new faces. One of the things that I always like to do is to get some grasp of where people are at. Have you been studying astrology for a while? This is all new to you? Okay. Kelly had already told me. Beth, is this all pretty new to you? Hannah, what was your name? Linda. Linda? Pretty new. Okay, so we've got some new people with this. Okay, all right. So again, tonight is just to understand how to decipher all of those glyphs. It's kind of like opening the door. Astrology is one of those subjects that never ends. There's always something else to learn. There's always something else to grow with. To give you just a little bit of information on me, I have studied astrology almost 20 years now, and I've worked for 18 years with a method of astrology that's called Evolutionary Astrology. And that's a very spiritual form of astrology that looks at a chart from the point of view of the soul. And so we have a formula we use with evolutionary astrology that looks to see where a soul is coming from by way of most recent past lives. Almost all astrology believes in reincarnation. And then we can also look at that chart to see the potential, or what we call the next evolutionary step. And so I'll refer throughout this class tonight to some of the philosophy of evolutionary astrology, as that's the method that I am most familiar with. So, and I have been practicing professionally charts, classes, etc. I can't remember, I was running through some material as I was getting ready for class, and I ran across some things from the early 90s. So I think it's somewhere around 10, 12 years that I've been actually teaching and reading charts. Anytime you have questions, please feel free to ask. I do not mind at all. Okay? All right? So what we're going to start out with is some of the astronomy that's behind astrology. Most of us kind of maybe have a brief idea that astrology is some symbolic method of looking at ourselves and understanding ourselves. Most of you here coming to a class at Crescent Moon would know astrology to be something of an esoteric method or an esoteric science, something that we would consider to be of the occult or spiritual. Occult is actually a word for hidden. That's all it means. It just means that there's more to it than what's on the surface. Well, astrology is kind of like the metaphysics. It's like the interpretive part. Astrology is based upon astronomy, which is the physics. They're two sides to the same coin. And in your ancient days, throughout most of history, up until about the 17th century, all of your astrologers were astronomers. There was no separation of the term. They were always together looking at things the same way. And I, by the way, am a Scorpio. And so I have a little bit of background in me that likes to have that left brain orientation as well as the right brain intuitive. So this is why we're going to start with a little bit of this astronomy so you can take this circle chart and kind of know how we get it from the heavens. Okay? So what we'll do is we're going to start with a couple of charts that I made. Let me get this down for you. Okay. Now, and what I have here, I have also got on this globe. So I've got two different ways that we can do this and look at everything, okay? Most of you would probably be comfortable in understanding that all the planets go around the sun, correct? That's called a heliocentric viewpoint. Helio meaning sun. So that means we all know that in reality, the sun is the center of our solar system and all of the planets go around the sun. Most of your Western astrology, and this is the type of astrology I'll be working with here tonight, most of your Western astrology is geocentric based. Geo meaning earth. In other words, when you look at that circle chart, at the very center of that chart, it's as if Earth was right in the middle, and at the moment someone was born, those were the planets around you in the heavens. So wherever you were born, and in my example, I use Rapid City, South Dakota, because this is where I live, this is where we are based. So it would be as if we here in Rapid City, South Dakota, were the very center of that circle, and if we looked all the way around us out to our horizon in a circle, we'd see the planets around us. All right? Geocentric. It appears as though all the planets are going around the chart, going around us. Everybody following me with that? When we look at a globe of planet Earth, okay, we all know that if we divided it in half horizontally, we'd have the equator, right? Okay? In astrology, one of the things that we will work with is that we'll take these circles that I have drawn in different colors, and we can extend them out into the sky around us. They become celestial spheres, as we call it. They just are a larger circle just outside the physical, surface of the globe. So we're all pretty familiar with the equator, correct? Well, planet Earth, as it's going around the sun, or as the sun appears to go around Earth, the Earth is not standing upright. As it's traveling around the sun, it's tilted. It's tilted at an angle of about 23.5 degrees. And so as it's tilted, okay, it then would mean that if we wanted to take another circle, we could look at actually this green circle that I have, okay, and we would have what we would call the ecliptic. And I'll tell you what, let me make it easier while I'm explaining these for you. Okay, I've got another one that I'm going to show you. Let's look at this one, because this has the colors that are similar to what I'm talking about in regards to this. I do not have the equator drawn on this circle. Okay, that's pretty simple. Everybody knows that. But if you look at this green circle, which is the ecliptic, all right, the ecliptic is the path that the sun appears to take around the Earth. Now, all of you are probably familiar when you look out to the sky here in the northern hemisphere, when we look out to the south, if we want to watch, we normally can't look at the sun for any length of time, but we can follow that path that the sun makes across the sky. It rises, culminates, and then sets. Have you ever noticed that the moon appears to cross that same path, pretty similar? And if you're out there at night watching the planets, all right, they appear to go almost in that same similar area. As a matter of fact, they go along a band that's about 16 degrees wide, 8 degrees either side of that ecliptic, and they all appear to travel in that same space across the sky. When you watch Mars, Venus, Saturn, the ones that you can see without a telescope, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto go along that same path, that same band that we call the ecliptic. All right? So everybody with me with this so far, as we're following this band that the planets make? Pluto actually goes 17 degrees beyond, it has a little bit more of an elliptical orbit than the regular band. It'll actually go outside of it a little bit. But we're all kind of familiar with this. If we stand here, watch the night sky, we see this band of the sun, the moon, the planets, etc., day and night as they're traveling across. They're going across it during the day with the sun, but when the sun's shining, it's just too bright for us to see them. All right? Familiar with that? Well, our ancients, when they would watch the sky a long time ago, they would also notice that along the same band that actually is the ecliptic out there in the sky, there would be these, what we would call the fixed stars. They appear to be in the same place. We actually know astronomically that everything is in motion. But some things are so far away and move so slowly that they appear to be fixed. And as our ancestors studied this band, watching these planets go across, behind them these fixed stars would be in groups that they came to name the constellations. The constellation of Aries, of Taurus, the 12 signs. Those 12 constellations also move in that same band. Okay? It's actually, again, us rotating on our axis every 24 hours that makes those 12 signs of the zodiac also appear to rise, culminate, and set. Everybody with me in regards to this? To do this? Okay. So what will happen with astrology? The ecliptic becomes kind of like the what would I call, almost like the bottom line. Okay, it becomes the area, the circle that we watch, that everything else takes place from. Okay, so let's go on to the next line with this. All right. So we know that we have then this band of the ecliptic, which I have put on this green line when you actually look at the globe. And I'll pass this around for you to each, so that each of you can look at this. But if we would say, for instance, that we had someone who was born in Rapid City, South Dakota. Here we are up here in North America, okay? So we're going to go on to then the next lines that form the different parts of the circle chart. What we would do is when we look at Rapid City, South Dakota, let's just take this point right here, Rapid City, South Dakota, and put it on top of the circle, just so that you can have the visual with that. If we did that and we looked out around the horizon and we took that plane of the horizon and we put it in the fattest part of the earth, it'd be this orange line that we're seeing. Okay? This would actually be called the horizon. And it would be parallel to this spot here on the earth. And if you look on there, I've actually drawn a horizon line, the orange line, which you can just see part of it. And again, that horizon can be parallel to any spot that anybody's born. But that horizon line just gets extended out there until it would be perpendicular to where something is. Okay? So then what we would do is if we followed this point where someone was born, this horizon line, if we followed it to the east, to the point where it crossed the ecliptic, we would have a spot that we would call the ascendant. And I marked it right here. The way that the beginning circle falls in any chart, and again, I'm talking about the point that becomes the first house in that circle chart, this spot right here. That is formed when the horizon, that perpendicular to anything, crosses the ecliptic going east. And do not worry if you're not going to understand all of this in its technical detail. This is more to just give you an intuitive grasp of it, so that you can understand the heavens become that flat circle. So if we go back to this spot, Rapid City, South Dakota, okay, and we took a line that intersected that spot and intersected the north and south pole, and we followed that spot to the south, we'd have a spot when it touched the ecliptic that we'd call the midheaven. And this is the blue line. And this blue line that goes through the north and south pole and the top, the zenith of the event location, the birthplace. When you follow it south to the ecliptic, it forms what we call the midheaven. And that's called the top of the chart. And I did the same thing here. I took this blue line and followed it from the poles south to the ecliptic, and this spot is what we call the midheaven. Now, the visual for this is that This is the spot right here that we call the midheaven. And we'll go over this stuff again. I'm just giving you an idea of how we find these lines, okay? And then there's another one. There's the red line. The red line, once you get the blue line going through the poles, then the red line would go perpendicular to that. This is the prime vertical. It's not used a lot in astrology in regards to the interpretation. Most people have never heard of the vertex or anti-vertex, but you can follow that line to the ecliptic, and it does mark some spots that are used with some methods of astrology. Okay? So, now, let's go back and do something else. Let's do this a little bit differently, but this is the visual of what these lines look like. Now let's go and go back to this right here. Here we can see that we took a globe of the sky, for instance, and we took this band of the zodiac, that 16-degree band, and here's Earth in the middle, and here's all of these little planets in this band, okay? We take that band and we can slice it out, and we can take this and we can turn it to get the circle chart. Everybody following me? Now in astrology we take the east and the west and we flip them over. We take the north and the south and flip them over. So if you're wondering, well, you're pointing the wrong direction for east, yes, in the astrological chart you will see that. I've also done some more visuals to give you an idea of that zodiacal band that goes around. And also here it is, you know, just like it is with the ecliptic. And there I've divided it into pie-shaped segments. So you can just get some visual and how this actually works. Everybody following this? Is this making sense for you with that? Okay. Any questions from anybody? Questions? Okay. All right, this is good. If we're okay with this, we're going to go on. So that wasn't hard, was it? I do the astronomy very, very simple. When I learned how to, when I first started studying astrology and started taking some classes, I actually learned how to cast the chart by hand with mathematical tables, calculator, etc. That happened for me back in the early 1980s. And that was right when computers, the home computer was really starting to come on, and we were really starting to see bookkeeping in businesses computerized. Well, I just thought that computers were the best thing in the world for astrologers. Because when you would actually do the math to cast this chart by hand, if you really wanted to be good with it and get it accurate, you could spend several hours, 2-3 hours, just trying to mathematically figure all this out. Well, those of you who have your own computers and your own astrological systems today, you punch 2 buttons in 30 seconds, you got the chart out of the printer. Well, I was just like, I'm not going to even bother with that. So to me, as long as you have this grasp of the astronomy and how we get from those heavens to that flat circle chart, that gives you enough of a left brain foundation in my eyes. And then we let the computers do the rest. Because then we can spend our time on the interpretation. We can spend our time on the fun part with it. So when we took those circles to get to this flat chart, okay, you notice inside we have 12 pie-shaped segments that go 1 through 12. And you notice that we start over here with the first pie-shaped segment. So you notice that this line becomes the starting point in the circle chart. This is the east, this is the west, this is the south, this is the north. The astrological world, for some reason, just decided to lay it down this way. So do not worry about that. Do not feel confused about that. I said I would pass this around, so let me just briefly pass it around so that you guys can just take your time looking at this. So then what I would like to do next is I'd like to start breaking down some of these glyphs that we see and get some brief definitions of what they are. I think what I would first of all like to do is have a brief little discussion on what we would call the houses. You know that we can take this circle and we can divide it into these 12 houses, all right? There are approximately 22 major house systems in astrology, meaning that we can divide this pie-shaped segment of 12 segments up a dozen or so different ways. Out of these 22 house systems, there's only a few major ones that are used. If you go back to what I told you about when we find the ascendant or the beginning of that circle chart, all the different house systems find the 4 quadrants of the chart. The first and the opposite 7th, this is the horizon line, and the 4th and the opposite 10th, okay, this is the meridian line. All of your house systems find the same points for the quadrants. The house systems differ in that they take one of those quadrants and they divide up the houses in between that differently. All right? I use the Porphyry house system. It's been around since 2300 AD. It was created by a gentleman called Porphyry. And it's a very simple house system to understand. It takes this quadrant, okay, and however many degrees turn out with this quadrant, it divides it up equally. Now here's the thing that we can also understand when we're looking at house systems. We know that a circle's 360 degrees, and if you divide it by 12, you got 30 degrees in each pie-shaped segment. Well, if you look at most of your charts in your different house systems, you will find that a house will have less than 30 degrees or it will have more than 30 degrees. What happens is because most of us were not born close to the equator, we can be born latitudes north, latitudes south, some of those houses start to stretch and other houses start to compact. Okay? So we will find that these houses will start to be, again, different sizes. Now, I did all this stuff by hand. I had a little help making the circle, but most of this I did by hand. It's much easier if you've ever tried drawing a circle chart, dividing it into 12, to just draw it all straight and nice so that you can see how everything goes. If you actually look at the visual that I have for George Bush, you can actually see, if you look at the chart, you can actually see that those houses, some appear to be smaller shaped, some appear to be larger shaped. Again, when we're not born close to the equator, we find that some of those things, some of these houses start to move. So the different house systems, the Porphyry house system, for instance, will say that if in this first quadrant, okay, it is 100 degrees instead of 90 degrees, we'll take that 100 and divide it by 3, and each one of these would be 33 1/3. Okay, and that means that this quadrant would become 80 degrees. It'd shrink, be the shrink half. So then we take 80 and divide it by 3. So the Porphyry house system is pretty easy to understand. Some of the other house systems that are used quite a bit is the Koch, K-O-C-K, K-O-C-H. And I don't pronounce words correctly all the time. Placidus, some people say. Those two house systems came along. One came along, I think, in, boy, I'm trying to think. I get them mixed up. One came along in like the 1600s. The other one came along in the 1800s. They use a little bit more complicated tables to define the houses. Right? Questions with just the fact that we can take these 12 houses and they can be unequal houses. Now there are also some house systems that are called equal house systems. If you see that, then they take that starting point, and whatever it is, they just go 30 degrees with each house around the chart, and they ignore the point that would be the midheaven. They ignore some of the other things that we saw visually with the globe. All right? Everybody following along with what I'm saying? So, we know that in this circle chart, we make this the beginning point. And then we go counterclockwise in a circle to get to the 12. Now, when we actually calculated the chart for George Bush, here's the geocentric, the porphyry, tropical. I got to back up. I'm remembering something else that I want to talk about before we go into these details. One more astronomy lesson, okay? The different astrological ages, the precession of the ages. You've heard that. Most of you have all heard that we're in process of leaving the Piscean age, moving into the Aquarian age. You've heard those terms. There's a lot of different opinions out there in regards to when we actually think we're leaving one age, moving to another. Some people feel it's already happened. Some people feel it's not going to happen for another 150 years yet. We're more or less somewhere in the transition process. I don't think anybody can say they have exactly the right date. Some of the books that I've put back there, I've put back Jeffrey Green, who is the creator of Evolutionary Astrology. Jeffrey has 2 books out on Pluto, which represents the soul in our method of astrology. And I also put some books out there called Measuring the Night, Volumes 1 and 2. That's actually a workshop, a series of workshops that were given by Jeffrey and Stephen Forrest. Stephen's another evolutionary astrologer. And in the back of these books, Measuring the Nights, Volume 1 and Volume 2, they've put their ideas of what they consider to be these great astrological ages, Piscean age, Aquarian age. So how do we more or less determine those ages? Do you remember when I talked about that band of the zodiac that we looked at when we followed the planets? And if we looked behind the planets at those fixed stars that were actually the constellations, and as the Earth rotated on its axis, every 24 hours, one of those in 24 hours, every single one of those constellations would rise, culminate, and set, and start all over again. 24 divided by 12, which meant that every 2 hours we'd see a different constellation of the zodiac rising on that eastern horizon. Kind of like sunrise, we see a constellation rising, all right? So we can again say more or less those constellations are a little fixed. But we do know over eons of time they move. Well, the Earth, when we go back to the globe of the Earth is kind of fatter at the equator than it is at the poles. Not very much, but just enough that the Earth has a tendency to wobble, okay? In other words, to show you a little visual like this, the Earth would have a tendency to just have a little bit of a wobble to it, all right? So most of your Western astrology, Western meaning those of us over here in the Western world, most of your Western astrology is based upon the tropical zodiac or the moving zodiac and versus the sidereal zodiac. The sidereal zodiac is based upon the actual constellations out there in the sky where they are at. The tropical zodiac is the moving zodiac. Many of you are familiar with the first day of spring coming along, March 20th, 21st, right along in there. In your Western astrology with the tropical zodiac, that first day of spring always becomes the beginning of the zodiac, the beginning of the moving zodiac, 0 degrees Aries. All right? Well, what happens is that every spring, when it comes along, where that point is, where we would actually see the sun looking out there, okay, from Earth, where that point where the sun is every day, every year, the first day of spring, it actually moves. Doesn't come back to the same spot. It moves backwards through the constellations out there in the heavens. And so for the last 2,000 years, the first day of spring has happened when the sun was actually in the constellation of Pisces, moving backwards. And we're now getting to the point where that first day of spring is starting to actually fall in the constellation of Aquarius. In other words, it moves backwards slightly. All right? Everybody following with that? So it takes, I think, 25,000 years, and then that first day of spring will come back to that same spot again with that. So just to help you out, here in our Western astrology with our tropical zodiac, if someone says that your sun sign is early degrees Scorpio, that's what it is in the tropical zodiac. In the sidereal zodiac, it's actually in Libra, because you would line up into that actual constellation. So we've kind of shifted, actually about 24 degrees backwards, that the sidereal differs from the tropical right now. All right? So you're following what I'm saying? Every year, that first day of spring comes at the latter part of March. But if we looked out there in the heavens and saw where the sun was, and we looked behind it, we'd actually see the constellation ending with Pisces and starting to shift backwards into Aquarius. Everybody follow that? Make sense? Okay, so this is what we're meaning when we say tropical. The moving zodiac. Geocentric, Earth-centered, porphyry house system. I'll explain the nodes for you later on. All right? So another way at which we can look at finding the beginning of this chart, all right, is when an individual is born, and in this case, George Bush, we're going to use an example. What we can do is at the moment he's born, we can look out across that horizon, okay? And if we look straight out across that eastern horizon at the moment he was born, there'd be a sign of the zodiac in that band of the ecliptic that would be rising. You've heard that term, rising sign, ascendant? That's what it means. At the moment in space and time that someone's born, there is a sign of the zodiac somewhere along that 30 degrees, so we can get to degree and minute with our math. And there's a sign that's rising. In George Bush's case, it's Leo. It's 7 degrees Leo, 6 minutes. So if we could actually look out there and visualize that, you know, we would see that. And again, it's all related to his birth date, his birth time, and his birthplace. All three of those coordinates will create the space and time that we can then look out on that horizon where it matches the ecliptic and it starts to rise. And we get the beginning of this chart, which is, in this case, 7 degrees Leo. Now, opposite that, if we look to the opposite point of the horizon, we'd have a sign of the zodiac setting. That would be the beginning of the 7th house cusp. And in Bush's case, it's 7 degrees Aquarius, 6 minutes. Following this? Everybody understanding what I'm saying in regards to this? Okay. Well, if we would imagine then with George Bush that he was born in New Haven, Connecticut at that moment, and we had Leo rising, okay? If we were standing in that spot where he was born, and we looked straight up and we took that meridian, okay, and we followed it with the North Pole across the zenith or straight above his birthplace, and we followed it down to the south till it got to the ecliptic, we'd have the midheaven. And this is what we call this point up here, which is the beginning of the 10th house cusp, the top of the chart. This is what was actually up above, followed to that ecliptic again. We get the midheaven. And in George's case, it's 24 degrees Aries, 12 minutes. And opposite that, which would then be the bottom of the chart, which would be totally straight below us, okay, following to the ecliptic the other way, we would have the beginning of the 4th house cusp, which would be 24 degrees Libra, 12 minutes in George's case. Okay, everybody following me? So any astrological house system will always come up with those same 4 points, except some of the equal house systems. All of them divide those 4 quadrants of the chart the same way. Okay? We're all comfortable with how we got to this circle, how we divided it up, and how we got that degree of the zodiac as the starting point. Okay? All right. One of your handouts that I want to start referring to then is a little handout where it's my glyph sheet. And you can see that it looks with, it's got a whole bunch of different things on it. This is basically a nice, handy, I used to call it my handy dandy sheet. And I decided, well, you know, maybe you should have something a little better than that. So now it's the glyph sheet. But it lists all of the planets in their astrological glyph, gives you their mean motion, meaning how fast they travel around the sun in one day, how much distance they go, how they're retrograde, that's next week's class, and their stationary period when they go retrograde, and then their revolution. The revolution is how long it takes them to each go around the sun. Okay? Or actually not around the sun, it's how long they appear to take to go around Earth, which is very close to their revolution around the sun. And then you see that we have the 12 houses and how they correlate to the natural zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, the glyphs for the 12 signs of the zodiac, the planets that rule the 12 signs of the zodiac, and their absolute longitude if we would divide the circle from 0 to 360 degrees. And then down on the bottom we have a list of all the aspects, what their mathematical angles are, their glyphs, and then we have the points in space that I talked about and their glyphs. This right here, excuse me, just to refer you, this beginning horizon point, the beginning of the chart is the ascendant. The opposite is the descendant. The top of this chart is the midheaven. The bottom of the chart is the nadir. All right? So now what I'd like to do is start to give you some brief definitions of all of these glyphs so that we can start and then and we'll actually start to relate it to this chart to see how they were actually out there. So if we go back to, again, this band of the ecliptic, at any moment when someone's born, we find that beginning horizon, we find that midheaven, and then we use our house system and we know how to get those 12 pie-shaped segments. But when we divide those up, there'll be a planet here, a planet there, a planet here, a planet there, and that's how those planets end up falling in those different houses. This is why that moment of birth is so important, because every 4 minutes this ascendant will change by 1 degree. Every 2 hours the ascendant will change signs, and we'll go over the definition of that for you. So that becomes very important to find that starting point, because it will then determine where the rest of those houses are and how those planets fit in those houses. All right? I just thought of it, a question that I get asked a lot. Well, I have houses in my chart that are empty. Does anything go on there? One of the things that George makes a good example with is you can see almost half of his chart is empty. So we still have planetary activity in these houses. We'll go to the definitions of the 12 houses very briefly, and so you can see that there's still planetary activity that goes on. This is a snapshot frozen in space and time of when someone's born. The planets didn't stop moving. They keep moving around this chart. It's known as the transits. The sun, this yellow spot, if hopefully we can see this okay, the sun will go around this chart once a year. It'll come back to the same spot. George will have a birthday. We call it a solar return in astrology. The moon, representing the emotions, will go around this chart in 1 month. We have a lunar return every month. In 1 month, every individual can experience every possible emotion. Moon with the emotions. Some of the planets, such as Pluto, take 248 years to go around the chart. Again, you can look at this glyph sheet and get an idea. So some move fast, some move quite slow. So there's always activity going on. And those transits, as they're moving along, bring the growth, bring the evolution that takes place. Everybody following with this? Okay. I have a tendency to be a pretty spontaneous speaker. This stuff is usually just here in my head, and I just kind of let it go with the flow as I feel led to say things. So please, again, ask questions if you have any. Let's start deciphering some of these glyphs. And I'll tell you what, probably what might be a little easier is to actually use this chart that we have with George Bush. And for the tape, I'm using Matrix software, and I'm using what we call the novice wheel. And still geocentric tropical porphyry houses. So I have a circle chart that has the planets just like that as we're looking at everything. We have what we call the planetary aspects grids. That's that triangle that's to the lower left. And then it actually lists the aspects and how many of them they are and some of the orbs. And then it actually lists the zodiacal signs, the planets, and where the planets are within the zodiac specifically for George Bush's chart. What I'd like to do, what I'd like to start with, is just very briefly give you some of the basics with the planets, and then the signs, and then the houses. All right. And it's also, you notice another handout that I gave you, so you can refer to more than one thing. You know, people have a tendency to, when they start to look at astrology, they start to feel overwhelmed a little bit, because there's the 10 planets, the 12 signs, the 12 houses. You start combining everything together. You add in these points of the circle, and it's just like, oh my gosh, there's so much to look at. Where do I start? Well, one of the things about evolutionary astrology is it has a formula. Once you learn the basics of the astrological archetypes, the meanings, it has a formula that you can utilize with a chart to know specifically where to start with all that information, to get the foundation of the soul and how to make sense from there. Before I can even tackle anything like that, we have to get most of the meanings and the definitions out of the way so that we can then start to put it together. But a response that I like to give to people when they start to say, oh my gosh, this is so complicated. Think about yourself. Think about the people that you know. We as human beings are complicated human beings. Astrology is just a reflection of what we ourselves are like. Now, one of the most important archetypes that we can begin to study astrology with is the planets themselves. The planets represent principles of energy within us. Sometimes I like to say they're the who, or the what, but they're the who. The planets represent principles of energy. And I'm just going to give you some very brief definitions. This is not an in-depth class. We could take one planet and spend 2 hours talking about just one planet. We can take anything in this, what we're doing tonight, and expand it into several other things. So In regards to the planets, very briefly, the sun is our personality. It's our life force. Most of us are probably familiar with our sun signs. People who know relatively little about astrology can kind of relate to their sun sign. You know, it's sun sign astrology is what you read about in the newspapers and the magazines that everybody will go to read on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. They're reading a method of astrology called sun sign astrology. And so most of us, again, can be very familiar with our sun sign and how our personality relates to that. The moon represents our emotional nature and our self-image. We all have to have some idea of what our self-image is like. It's how we navigate through everything on an emotional basis. Mercury is the planet of communications. It represents the left brain and the conscious mind. Venus is the planet of giving and receiving love. Venus in evolutionary astrology is also known as our essential needs. Our values come from Venus. Mars is the planet of action. Mars is our conscious desires. It's our motivator. These are the personal planets that I've talked about so far. Sun through Mars, those are our personal planets. Now we can move into the next two planets that are the social planets. Jupiter. Jupiter in evolutionary astrology represents our intuition, our right brain. This is where we start to go outside of ourselves and work with our senses. Work with something more than that is just us. We come to know it as the intuition. Some people will call it the sixth sense. Jupiter is also how we start socializing with the rest of the world. And it's also our individual belief systems. The next social planet is Saturn. Saturn is the individuated consciousness. Individuated consciousness. It's the boundaries of what we are conscious of. It is space and time, reality. Space and time, reality. Okay? Whenever you have to come back into the body and function in the body in real time, that's Saturn. Saturn can also be known as authority and security. We start to move into, there's many different branches of astrology. We're going to have a concentration a little bit on more spiritual astrology. But there's also many different kinds of astrology that we can work with. I'll go to the last three planets and then I'll talk about some of the different branches of astrology. Next we're going to move into the what we call the outer planets. They're also the unconscious planets. In other words, these are the three planets that symbolize our unconsciousness. You notice up through Saturn, they're all visible in the sky with the naked eye. We can all see them. We can all be conscious of them. The three outer planets are unconscious, and we cannot see them with the naked eye. We can only see them through a telescope. Uranus. Uranus is the individuated unconsciousness. The individuated unconsciousness. So it's the unconscious mind. Very briefly, Uranus contains 3 types of information in the unconsciousness. It contains the past in all its detail, including past lives. It contains everything we try to suppress. In other words, Saturn, the individuated consciousness, whatever Saturn can't handle in space-time reality, we try to push away, we try to push under, we try to forget, we put it into the unconsciousness. Uranus catches it. Uranus throws it back up. Uranus also contains the blueprint to the future. So it contains the past, it contains what we suppress, usually via the present, but also in the past, and it contains the blueprints of the future. So when we have those famous Uranian moments, we have the past coming up, we have a vision into the future, we have all kinds of things going on. Then we move into Neptune. Neptune is the collective conscious unconsciousness. Neptune is what we could symbolize as God Goddess. It is our collective beliefs. It's the deepest level of our spirituality or beliefs that we can get to. And then we have the planet Pluto, the furthermost planet in our solar system. In evolutionary astrology, Pluto represents the soul, which for most of us is on an unconscious level. It can represent the soul individually and collectively. So we can have a collective soul. That's real brief. Give a much expanded version of that. So can you understand how these planets can represent principles of energy? And this is just some brief little words, but then you can start to work with this to get an archetype of what this energy is. Now, for those of you who would like a great recommendation on studying the planets, in Jeffrey Wolf Green's book, Pluto Volume 1, which Robin can easily get these books through Crescent Moons. Jeffrey's Pluto books, by the way, are some of the most widely published books on astrology there is. The book has been translated into 6 different languages. Jeffrey Wolf Green. You know, if you go to major cities or you start watching for astrological books, there are a lot of books out there on any subject. You know, it's very easy for anybody to be a publishing house and publish their own books if they have enough money, self-publish. Jeffrey's book, Pluto Volume 1, has just been one of the best-selling astrology books that's out there. And so I highly recommend it to understand the archetypes of the planets, the signs, and the houses. And how he speaks about the planetary archetypes is in the back of Pluto Volume 1. He talks about Pluto, the soul, in aspect to every other planet, in aspect to the Sun, Moon, Mercury, etc. Just to read those definitions would give you a depth of meaning to each of those planetary principles of energy. So I would strongly recommend just, jumping to that part of the book to start to understand what those planetary symbols mean. And then in Pluto Volume 1, what he does is he goes through Pluto in each sign or house of the zodiac. For instance, when we start looking at, I'm trying to think if I did this. I don't think I did it, but your handouts show it. If we start looking at this first pie-shaped segment that we call the first house, in the natural zodiac, this would relate to Aries. The second one would be Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. So we could look at Aries in the first house being related, Taurus in the second house being related, Gemini in the third. So in Pluto Volume 1, Jeffrey will go through Pluto through all those houses. And just reading each one of those could also give you a much more in-depth look on those archetypes of the signs and the houses. Okay? So let me just briefly state, and then we're going to take a little break here. Let me just briefly state that the signs of the zodiac add color and characteristic to the houses of the zodiac, which represent areas of life. So the houses of the zodiac always, this is always the first house. These houses are always in that same counterclockwise location, starting here and going around the chart. So the houses can represent the areas of life, okay? The where. And the signs of the zodiac will move because we rotate, the earth rotates on its axis every 24 hours, and those signs are always moving. So we can have any sign of the zodiac on any one of the houses. And so those signs add color and characteristics, okay? Some of the how, if you want to go who, where, how. Planets being who, houses being where, signs of the zodiac being the how. Does this help? Is this making sense for everybody? Being able to follow this? Okay? I think what I'd like to do is just take a brief little break for 5 minutes. Let everybody get a little refreshed, stand up, stretch, and then we'll come back and we'll go for another half hour to 45 minutes. All right, everyone. We're going to start up again with the signs and the houses. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of a formula on how to work with them. And so hopefully you can all see what I've written. I have the circle here, and you can see again the 12 houses going counterclockwise, always starting with this is the first house. And I put all of the glyphs for the natural zodiac going around here. Okay? And so again, you can look on that glyph sheet and you can see the glyph for Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, etc. around the chart. And so we can remember that the signs of the zodiac will add color and characteristic to the houses of the zodiac, which represent the departments of life, the areas of life. Okay? Now, before we briefly go through those 12 archetypes, signs and houses, there's some astrological harmonics, as I call it, that we can work with. We can take that circle of 12 and we can divide it into 2, we can divide it into 3, and we can divide it into 4. And in astrology, when we take that circle of 12 and we divide it into 2, we have polarities, active and passive. When you divide it into 3, we have qualities, cardinal, fixed, and mutable. When we divide it into 4, we have elements, fire, earth, air, and water. All right? These are just different archetypes of energy that then help to make meaning out of the signs and the houses. So if we take the circle of 12, or the zodiac of 12, and we divide it into 2 polarities, then I say active and passive. Kind of know what I mean, right? Okay. I could also say masculine and feminine. I could also say outer and inner. You start to get that polarity of 2. You start to understand that meaning. All right. So we can go then, starting with the first house or the first sign, and we can go around the zodiac, and I tried to color coordinate this for you so that we could go first house active, second passive, third active, fourth passive, and we could go active, passive all the way around. Everybody follow that? With that? That's why I gave you, I think one of your handouts was just a plain circle chart to just help you with some of the note-taking if you wanted to. So we can know that the 12 signs, the 12 houses, can have a natural affinity to the polarities of being active or passive. Also yang and yin. Masculine, feminine, outer, inner. You can start to get the idea of what I'm talking about with that manifestation of two. It's actually with numerology, it's the harmonics of two. Okay? So we can also take that circle of 12, that zodiac of 12, and we have the qualities, which is the harmonics of 3. We can divide that circle by 3, okay? Qualities are sometimes also called modes of action, a quality of how we go about things. And we have cardinal, fixed, mutable. You can kind of understand how they would do that. And if you look at these 3 qualities, each quadrant of the circle, if we divide the circle in 4, each quadrant is 3 houses. We have a cardinal, a fixed, and a mutable house. We can look at the signs. Each the circle divided by 4, each quadrant of the 3 signs, cardinal, fixed, mutable. They're pretty much how they sound. The cardinal is initiating. It goes out there and starts something. It initiates. The fixed is persevering. It carries onward. It holds the energy. The mutable is the adaptable, the ever-changing, the transforming. So it's just like they sound. And so again, we can go around the zodiac of the signs, the 12 houses, cardinal, fixed, mutable, cardinal, fixed, mutable, all the way around. Following that? Okay. Then the next step is the elements, which is dividing the zodiac by 4. And the elements is another way of putting that as the elements is again, this is just a quality of energy. The elements, the 4 elements are very common in most of your astrology. These get to be pretty well known. Fire, earth, air, water. Fire is spirit. Earth is physical. Air is mental. And water is emotional. When you also look at this, when we start working with the elements, we can work with, and this is Western. Your Eastern adds in a 5th element. But this is the Western way of the 4 elements. You can also start to look at just some of your basic metaphysics. We have something on the spiritual level of the beliefs. It's brought down into the mental plane with thoughts and attitudes. Then it's brought down into the emotional plane and emotionalized. And then it manifests on the physical level. So we're pretty much aware with those 4 basic planes in metaphysics. This is how they relate in astrology. Okay? So anytime, and to me, a little side trip for you, an example of some of the woundedness that I consider to be on the planet today is like even in some of your metaphysical movement, you will notice body, mind, spirit. The body, the mind, the spirit. Anytime I see those three words together, I go, where's the heart? Where's the fourth element? Where's the water? Where's the emotions? Okay? So as you're working with anything, you always want to work with all four of those elements. Now in astrology, the order that they happen to go in, following the zodiac, following the houses, is fire, earth, air, water. Fire, earth, air, water, and one more time. Okay? So are we starting to follow this? And we go with that? Okay. Questions from anybody in regards to this? So when we are starting to teach ourselves astrology, and we start to work with those 12 signs and those 12 houses, and we're working for the definitions of those, the archetypal meanings, we can come back to polarities, qualities, and elements. And so, for instance, we can start to go to Aries as a sign, and the first house is an area of life, and it's active cardinal fire. Phew! Get some interpretation just from that. Active cardinal fire. We got initiating spirit. We have initiation. No sitting still here, is there? Anybody who knows an Aries, someone who's sun sign in Aries, they don't sit still. They're always initiating. They're the first sign of the zodiac. They're going to be first. They're always going out there. Does this make sense? So you can work your way around then through these 12 houses and signs. And this will help you with some of the interpretation. And then, for instance, if you would like to add on Jeffrey's book, Pluto Volume 1, as he goes through Pluto through the 12 signs or houses, you'll start to fill in some of these polarities, qualities. You'll start to understand some of these deeper levels with this. Okay? Making sense? So briefly, we can go to Taurus. Taurus is passive, fixed earth. Anybody know any physically stubborn Taurians? Don't worry, we can make fun of all 12 signs. We're not picking on anybody here, okay? So they start to make sense. Passive means that they'll attract it in versus go out after it. Fixed means that they'll sustain what? Earth, the physical, the practical. This gets known as the house of possessions. Taurus is known for its values. Can we start to see where some of this stuff is coming in regards to this? Making sense for everyone? Then we can move on to Gemini. In the third house, we have active, mutable air. Active, mutable air. We think of Geminis and they talk. They're here. They always have ideas. They can talk about whatever position you take. A Gemini can take the other position, the twins. Active, mutable air. Mental energy that's just here and there and everywhere. Start to make sense for Gemini? This is the third house. This is the house of communications. So you can start to see where this will fit in. Then we can move on to Cancer and the fourth house. We have passive cardinal water. Passive cardinal water. The symbol for Cancer is the crab. And the crab doesn't go in a straight line. It goes sideways and around, and it makes its way. Passive cardinal. So it's initiating with the cardinal quality of energy, but it's also passive. So it goes back and forth. And it's water, so it's emotions. So we think of that Cancerian energy, and it's emotional energy that sometimes is very nice and sometimes is walls, leave me alone. Okay, start to follow this. This is the fourth house of the home and the family. In evolutionary astrology, that fourth house is dealing with issues of emotional self-reliance. So we can start to see where some of this comes in. Now, let me back up. Let's add something else in because this is going to also help make sense. Let's go back to Aries, active cardinal fire. Each of the signs of the zodiac have what we call a planetary ruler. In other words, there's a planetary principle of energy that is synergistic, harmonious with the sign of the zodiac, and even with that house of the zodiac. In astrology, it's called a rulership. Aries is ruled by the planet Mars. Remember we said Mars was our conscious desires and action? Well, we can relate active cardinal fire to Aries. We can see how Mars would fit in really good with this. How Mars would always want to go out there and initiate those actions. We can move on to Taurus. In the second house, the natural ruler of Taurus is Venus. Remember we said Venus was the planet of our essential needs and values, giving and receiving love. And here is passive fixed earth. So Venus wants to fit in. This is the second house, is the house of possessions. So Venus dealing with our values. Your values are going to determine your possessions. Whether you need the BMW or you're okay with a bicycle. Okay? Gemini. Gemini is ruled by Mercury. Remember, Mercury was the conscious mind in the left brain. Can you see how Mercury would relate to Gemini in the third house with active, mutable air? Is this starting to make sense for you with this? Okay. Cancer. Cancer is ruled by the moon. Remember the moon being the emotions, passive cardinal water. And remember we talk about that Cancerian energy. The emotions can be going any which way. This is this energy right here. So now let's move on to Leo and the fifth house. The natural ruler of Leo is the sun. And so now we have active fixed fire. Fire is that spirit. So we think of that Leonian energy that likes to be out there shining. And what is the sun? It's a very sustaining level of energy, the fixed energy. And it's also active. You will find that if you start to follow this, your fire and air elements are always active, and your earth and water elements are always passive. Okay? And then you can find that if we take the element fire, we have cardinal fire in Aries, we have fixed fire in Leo, we have mutable fire in Sag. So those elements and qualities start to intermingle with each other. Everything starts to come together in those harmonics of 2, 3, and 4. So Leo, the fifth house is known as creativity, children, romance. Third house is siblings. Okay? Let's go on to Virgo. This is very brief. We're just getting the basics of the definitions. We're not going into an in-house depth thing here. We're just trying to get the basics of the definitions so you can look at that chart as you want to start studying it. Virgo, relating to the sixth house, is ruled by Mercury. We have 10 planets. We have 12 signs. We have 12 houses. We have 2 planets that will rule 2 signs and be in the natural houses of 2 houses. Virgo is ruled again by Mercury. Mercury, the left brain, planet of communications, passive, mutable earth. Whereas in Gemini, Mercury is air, and it's just talk, 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 talk. It's very mental. Over here, Mercury becomes physical, earth, becomes practical. You hear about the practicality of Virgos. You hear about the analyzing of Virgos. That's the mutable. Okay? You hear about the passiveness This is that they're drawing it into them. So the Virgo is always going to draw in all those facts and details to analyze, to figure out how they can make sense of it. Earth, how they can be practical with it. The 6th house can also be known as the house of work. It's also the house of self-improvement. The first 6 signs of the zodiac, the first 6 houses of the zodiac, all deal a lot with self. The second 6 signs of the zodiac, the second 6 houses, all work with others. So now we're going to start the shift from self to others. And we're going to move into Libra with the 7th house, and Libra is ruled by Venus. Here's the second sign Venus rules, active cardinal air. We like to call Taurus the inner side of Venus, our essential needs, and Libra the outer side of Venus, the socializing. This 7th house, which has the descendant, the cusp of the 7th house, this line dividing the 6th and the 7th, that's called the descendant. And that goes with that sign of the zodiac that was setting, descending on the horizon, matching the ecliptic. This is the point of relationships. The ascendant, the beginning, is the point of self. Opposite that, the descendant, cusp of the 7th house, is others. It's the beginning of relationships. So here we have active cardinal air. This is socializing Venus. Okay, so and that 7th house can represent all kinds of relationships. In evolutionary astrology, your 7th house is courtship and your 8th house is marriage. Okay? Little different than some of the traditional astrology that you hear. Following, then we're going to move on to Scorpio and the 8th house. Its natural ruler is Pluto. Pluto, remember, represented the soul, mostly unconscious, either the individual soul or the collective soul. We are dealing with passive, fixed water. When we get to the depth of the soul, we will find that it is very emotionally based. Evolutionary astrology has a saying, evolution takes place through the emotional body. We can have all of the spiritual wisdom we can find. We can have all of the mental genius that's out there. But until we can walk our talk, we're not going to be in wholeness. In other words, we have to take that spiritual, mental component and bring it into the emotional body and walk the talk. So we have passive fixed water. We have very fixed emotions here. Passive or back into attracting in. So when we're dealing with the polarity of passive, we get security. We get involved with the issue of security. And so this 8th house has been known as, in your traditional astrology, taxes and money and death and rebirth, that type of stuff. That starts to get into the depths of the soul here. In evolutionary astrology, this 8th house is where we will really merge with others, which is why we call it the marriage point. And if you know any Scorpios, they have a tendency to get very intense emotionally, even when they pretend to be otherwise. Next we go on to Sag, and it relates to the natural 9th house. The ruler of Sag is Jupiter. Jupiter was that right brain, the intuition, the personal belief systems. What we're dealing with here is active, mutable fire. Fire is spirit. So here we know we can deal back with those belief systems. When we're dealing with the fire, Sag, Leo, Aries, we're dealing with some intuition, just because it's the spirit. It's the element of the spirit. We've got active, mutable fire. And so here, Sag is known as the philosopher. This is the area of life that is known as philosophy and the belief systems, you know, publishing and writing, when we get into some of the more mundane things. And so we can see this active, mutable fire. We're trying to put it all together. And we get another piece of information, and we have to adapt mutable to get that larger picture to everything. Okay? Then we go to the top of the chart. We have Capricorn relating to the natural 10th house. Its ruler is Saturn. Remember, when we're up here at the top here again, we have that point we call the midheaven. This is the top of the chart. It's the opposite the bottom of the chart, which we call the nadir. So these two houses, the 4th and the 10th, relate to each other. When we're up here at the top of the chart, this is the midheaven. In your traditional astrology is known as the career. It's the point where we're out there in the world. Versus this bottom of the chart with Cancer being the home and the family, the inner world and the outer world. So in evolutionary astrology, what will be represented here at the cusp of the 10th house is self-responsibility and self-determination. Those are two qualities that make up the career. All of us, well, those of us here in the Western world where we have the freedom to choose a career, the career is determined by our self-responsibility, our self-determination, our ability to take charge of our life and go out there and create what we want to create. Okay? So we're dealing with passive cardinal Earth. Here we are back to Earth, back to the physical. We can understand how that can get in there and relate to some of these issues of career and authority. Saturn, remember Saturn, that individuated consciousness, space and time reality. You can see how it fits in there. We have the passive cardinal Earth. Down here in Cancer, we had the passive cardinal water. So we kind of, that passive cardinal thing, there's kind of some back and forth here, okay? By the time we get up here to the top of the chart in Capricorn, we can learn to come to a more concise ability to determine how we are going to initiate things cardinal. Okay, this is always known as the goals. So you can start to see how is this making sense? How this starts to fit together, just using the harmonics of the numbers with this. We have a kitty who's getting everything he can. Okay, so now we'll go on to Aquarius and its natural affinity with the 11th house, and its ruler is Uranus. Uranus was the individuated unconsciousness. Remember how it contained the past, blueprints of the future, everything we suppress? Here we have active fixed air. There's the air again. So here we can see we have the mental. Uranus was the individuated unconsciousness, the unconscious mind. We can see how we can get that from the air part. It's active fixed. This kind of gets to go back and forth with each other in that, you know, how many of us are conditioned by the unconsciousness? Those unconscious patterns that we keep repeating. That's where the fixed comes in. Now the activeness of this, for me, what I like to say, is the whole purpose of Uranus, Aquarius, and the 11th house is to take what's unconscious and bring it to the surface. Uranus, you read in your traditional cookbooks about Aquarius and Uranus having to do with those lightning bolts, those flashes of insight. It's something unconscious coming to the surface. Okay? So in your traditional astrology, this is friends, hopes, wishes. In evolutionary astrology, this is deconditioning. The unconscious is throwing things up to the surface so that we can break free from the past and be who we uniquely are. Last, we have Pisces and its affinity to the 12th house, and this is ruled by Neptune. Neptune was that collective conscious unconsciousness. It was God Goddess. It was our broadest way that we could tap in to energies in the universe. We have passive mutable water. When we're dealing with water as well as with fire, we can get into the intuition. We get into the emotions. Passive mutable. That means we're just like a psychic sponge, soaking things in. Soaking things in on emotional levels. So Neptune and Pisces in your traditional astrology fall in with terms like illusions and delusions. When we're not attuned with the source, we get caught up in all the confusions and delusions of everything. So does this help? Does this make sense for everybody as we start to go through this? Okay? So now, if I say we go back to this quadrant we were looking at, and we have the beginning of the chart, the ascendant, this is the point of self. It opposes the descendant, which is the point of others. And then we look at the perpendicular line that makes this into the quadrants. We go to the bottom, the nadir, and this is the emotions. And we go, or the inner world, and we go to the opposite, the top of the chart, the midheaven, and we have the outer world. Okay? So can you see how we have self, others, home, the world? Now does this make sense how we get to those 4 main quadrants with that? Help? Questions from anybody in regards to this? Okay. I'm going to, I've covered most of the material that I have wanted to cover under these definitions. I'd like to go back to the glyph sheet just for a moment and say, so now we can look at those planets which represent the principles of energy, and we can look at the glyphs that are represented by them. And if we wanted to start learning transits, how the planets are actually moving, we look at the mean motion, how fast they would travel around this circle chart, this wheel of 360 degrees in a day. The retrogrades, that's the class for next week. Next week we'll go in and focus on those planets in more detail, and we'll look at the retrograde cycle. In other words, from our geocentric viewpoint, some of these planets can appear to go backwards. And when they do, it's a time for re-evaluating and understanding that energy better. So we'll go into more detail with that. Houses, natural zodiac, and those glyphs, the planetary rulers, you can see where we have all of those. And then the absolute longitude, the aspects, we'll work with that stuff in the 3rd class, the cycle of aspects. So any definitions, anybody think of any terms in astrology that I have not discussed that you'd like to ask a question about? We're doing pretty good. You guys are wonderful. We'll continue with definitions in the next 2 classes, but we'll do them as they're relevant. The whole purpose of this was to allow you to get to the point of being able to look at an astrological chart and have some idea of where all of that stuff comes from. In the handout that I gave you in regards to George Bush's chart, if you will just briefly look at the upper left, you will see it lists the 4 elements and it lists the 3 qualities. You see that right there with that? Now, you will notice that they add up to 12 and not 10. It's including the ascendant and the midheaven. It's including the 10 planets, and then it's including the ascendant, and it's including the midheaven. So that's how we're coming up with 12 instead of 10. Otherwise, I think we've done it. Any questions on any definitions? I mean, we can go to definitions forever. But I'll continue with the rest of them in the next couple of weeks with that. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Enjoy your charts. Okay, Yvonne asked a question. She was actually looking at George Bush's chart, all right? And she was saying that everything appears to be over here in this hemisphere, this half of the chart, which we would call the east side. This is known as self. When we look at the first through 6th house, first 6 houses, okay? This is known as ourself, this is known as others, or this is actually known as also, in addition to just self, this is known as the world at home, this is known as others in the world out there. We can also look at the hemisphere this way and go from the 10th through the 3rd houses, this would be called the east side, this is known as self, and this 4th through 9th houses is known as others. So we can tell in just looking at George Bush's chart that we have almost everything over here on the personal side, the side of self in the zodiac.
So he's really into himself?
Yes.
He's really self-centered?
Yes. Yes. Well, I like to always use the current president in my chart examples because it's someone that we can easily study through news in the public. Kelly, question?
I was just wondering about people who have like 4 planets, or 4 planets in one sign.
Say
My
we
daughter's got 4 planets in Leo.
I have 5 planets in one house. I have half the planets in one house. So that's a concentration of energy.
Right.
And it's a concentration of energy with that sign of the zodiac or that house of the zodiac. It means that soul is doing a lot of manifestation in a certain area of life with a certain characteristic of energy represented through that sign.
So it's something she needs to learn this time around.
You'd have to look at the whole chart, but it's definitely going to be a strong part of who she is. And in evolutionary astrology, there's this rule of thumb. Whenever you see a planet in a certain sign in a certain house, you look to the opposite sign and house for answers. Remember that polarity of 2, the manifestation of the opposites? The opposite sign and house is going to bring you information, answers, wholeness, the balance. Okay? All right. Now, it's a good thing we put the tape back on. There's one more definition that I've realized that I missed. And this is these 2 horseshoe-shaped things in green in George's chart, the nodes. These are very important factors in evolutionary astrology. And as a matter of fact, they work with the formula in Pluto in discovering the soul. How do I say this? This node, okay, this one, the node up here in the 11th house, that's the symbol for the north node. The other symbol is just the opposite, upside down. They look kind of like horseshoes. That's the south node down here in the 5th house in George's chart. All right? And the north node and south node are always going to be opposite each other. Here's the astronomy. Do you remember the ecliptic, which was that apparent path of the sun around the earth? Okay? Once a month, as the moon's traveling around this ecliptic path too, only not exactly on that line, once a month the moon will cross the ecliptic and go north of it. That point where it crosses is called the north node. Half a month later, 2 weeks later, the moon will cross that ecliptic going south. That point's called the south node. At the moment in space and time George was born, if we would look to see where the moon's path was crossing northward on the ecliptic, it'd be this point, the north node. In George's case, it was 20 degrees Gemini, 32 minutes. If we look at the point where that moon was going to cross the ecliptic going south on his chart at the moment in space and time he was born, we see that that south node is 20 degrees Sag, 32 minutes. All right? This makes sense for you? Now, it so happens that in the astronomical world, twice a year, when the moon is crossing the sun's path, going northward, 6 months later when the moon's crossing that opposite spot going southward, just so happens the sun's in the same spot, and we have eclipses. That's where the lunar and solar eclipses come from, because the earth, the sun, and the moon are lined up on that ecliptic path. Okay? And so all of us have a north node and a south node in our chart. The south node, now here's the symbolism, the astrology. The south node represents the past. In evolutionary astrology, it has a specific definition in that it was the mode of operation and how the soul acted in past lives. Now, it can be what we would know sometimes as habits, some of the areas of our life that we unconsciously gravitate to. Sometimes some of the things that we need to let go of. That's a more traditional term. Opposite that, the north node. The north node represents how we're striving to grow in this life. So the south node has some correlation to the past. The north node has some correlation to the future. And the north node gives us a mode of operation that's going to give us information of how the soul is going forward in this lifetime. Again, in evolutionary astrology, the nodes have specific meanings and definitions and the whole archetype of meaning. Now, the interesting thing about George Bush's chart is the planet Pluto, which represents the soul individually and collectively. Pluto, which brings so much of what we would call death and rebirth for everyone, is going to be traveling back and forth over 20 degrees Sag in 2003, this year. It's going to be going back and forth over his south node in the 5th house. So when we look at a soul who has a south node in Sag in the 5th house, this is someone who's wanted to be the center of attention in his past lives. 5th house, Leo. And he's also wanted to be a voice, Sag. He's wanted to be the spiritual leader in past lives. And so here's Pluto, the south node, Pluto in Sag crossing over this south node. One of the things that we deal with Leo energy is the ego versus the soul. So if we have a person who has wanted to be the leader and the center of attention for his own needs versus the needs of the collective as a leader, there's going to be some things to be addressed here as Pluto crosses over this spot. It's going to oppose the north node and moving forward. And then here in the 11th house in Gemini, this is going to be about detaching and hearing what's really being said, Gemini, versus hearing what we want to hear. And look what's conjunct together, right smack dab close to the North Node. Uranus, the individuated unconsciousness. When you see a soul who has Uranus conjunct the North Node, it means that in this lifetime, they must have detachment. They must have things coming up so that they will be able to see it from a broader picture. Uranus, remember, Uranus was that individuated unconsciousness, the past, the future, everything we suppress. It's in the 11th house. It's in the house that it rules. So when you look at this symbolism together, this is someone who's going to go through shock and trauma to learn to look at things differently. This is all activated, the past and the future. This year, the way George Bush is going it's a repetition of what has come before for him. And there are lessons in learning how to detach and hear what's really being said, to hear a broader picture, to be able to look at a larger picture versus just fifth house, what he is wanting to see and hear. So we can have someone who, in interpretation, we have someone who's going out there thinking he has the message that everybody wants to hear, and he's getting some query and shocks from leaders of other countries who are going, wait a minute, we have a different opinion than you. So you see how this is playing out? This is just a tidbit of astrology. And so, again, those nodes, North Node, South Node, they give information, the nodes of the moon, I need to clarify, they give information as to how the soul operated in the past and how it's striving to learn and grow and operate in the future. South Node, North Node. Now, to give you one step further, every single planet has a South Node and a North Node. And evolutionary astrology, when it starts to move into its advanced levels, will work with the South Node of Venus, how we went about love in past lives. And it'll work with the North Node of Venus, how we're striving to grow in love in this lifetime, and where Venus currently is in a chart by house and sign in a current lifetime will represent where the soul is at in the current moment. We can go into the nodes of all the planets, but again, that's something that you'll find a lot in the astrology books. Zach, question?
Well, I just wanted a comment on the fact that Uranus is moving into Pisces
Yes.
in a few days,
Yes.
changing signs. And in George's chart, I was wondering if you could give a thought or two on what that might mean for him.
Well, Uranus is going to move into Pisces, and that puts it at the end of the 7th house for George, and getting ready to move into the 8th house, because the 8th house is 2 degrees 48 minutes Pisces. So hold on a second, I can't remember where Uranus goes retrograde at this year. Oh dear. Uranus goes retrograde at 2 degrees Pisces, 49 minutes. 1 minute, not 1 degree, 1 minute into the 8th house. The 8th house, remember, is death and rebirth. The 8th house has to do with the marriage point, relationships. I think there's a lot of divorce going on in regards to America's relationships with other countries. You know, there can be some strong emotional shocks. Relative to Pisces, remember Pisces naturally being that 12th house ruled by Neptune. Relative to that, there can be some aspects of him that just does not want to face reality, that does not want to face what's really going on with that. Definitely some emotional shocks, and most of the reason we each go through emotional shocks is to wake us up from the past, to break free from the past and to grow. So he's got some real strong things going on in his chart this year. It's a very crucial year for him. It's a crucial year for the country. It's a crucial year for all of us, as he is the ruler of the country. So, pray peace. Be peace, as I say it.
So you're saying he had a past life where he wanted to be a ruler, he wanted to be known, or that?
He has past lives of being the ruler. of being a ruler.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is just like another.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Pluto, his soul, is just inside the first house cusp.
Can
So.
you look at a chart and see on his past lives how he was as a ruler?
Well, relative to a whole bunch of things, one being the evolutionary state of his soul being in consensus state, how he is now is pretty much how he was in the past.
He unlearned lessons. He's repeating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. So.
I just have one real quick question. When you taught this class a few years ago, and we're picking on Clinton, did he have a lot in self too? Planets?
Clinton,
Yeah.
Clinton had a 11th house Pluto soul, which was
Yeah.
breaking free from the past and deconditioning. Clinton had a Libra rising, and remember he had all those planets right on the first house cusp in Libra, and he had Venus and Mars there, so he had to initiate all of this diversity of relationships to figure out how to give and receive love. And we all know how that played out.
I mean, what if that's the thing with presidents, that they're all in the self?
No.
No?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
Just so happened. Clinton was the first Pluto in Leo president. So before that, we had Pluto in Cancer presidents, and the Pluto in Cancer generation was very much the traditional, the masculine, feminine roles. And so Clinton, being the first Pluto in Leo president, was, that Pluto in Leo generation made divorce an okay word. And so we saw him really breaking free into allowing, the opposite of Leo, that Aquarian polarity that his generation strives for. He was there to allow the wife to be a co-creator and co-equal on many ways. Mm-hmm. Bush is the Pluto in Leo generation as well, very much into self with that Pluto in the first house. Okay. Thank you all very much. I appreciate you coming out tonight. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.